and welcome to Ron Hasn't Seen. This month, I'm focusing on Academy Award Best Picture winners that I haven't seen. And while I haven't seen most of the ones before this, I'm starting with 1940's Rebecca. I originally intended to start with Wings, the first Best Picture winner, but I couldn't actually find it on any streaming services at the time, so I'm starting here. Rebecca is based on the novel by Daphne du Maurier. The film was directed by Alfred Hitchcock, produced by David O. Selznick of Gone with the Wind fame, and written by Robert E. Sherwood and Joan Harrison. It starred Laurence Olivier as Maxim de Winter, Joan Fontaine as our unnamed protagonist, and Judith Anderson as Mrs. Danvers. In addition to Outstanding Production, the category that would become Best Picture, it also won the award for Best Black and White Cinematography for George Barnes, and it was nominated for 9 other Oscars, including Director, Actor, Actress, Supporting Actress, Screenplay, Art Direction, Editing, Score, and Special Effects. So the movie is based on du Maurier's 1938 novel, and Rebecca was Hitchcock's first American film, even though it's mostly set in the English West Country. The film is a fairly faithful adaptation, aside from one main plot point. In the novel, Rebecca was actually shot by Maxim, and in the film, she falls and hits her head, and it's an accident. This was to comply with the Hollywood production code at the time, because if Maxim had killed her, they wouldn't have been able to get the happy ending. You would have had to have his comeuppance in some way. While du Maurier actually liked this adaptation, it didn't mean there weren't problems on the set. Hitchcock and Selznick styles really clashed. Hitch was more of a minimalist, shot only what he needed, and didn't try and rely on post-production. While Selznick was into the spectacle and over-the-topness, as you can see like in Gone with the Wind. And he liked to re-edit the footage himself to recraft the story as he wanted. And the way Hitchcock shot to the way it originally screened in a rough cut led to some reshoots and some minor changes to the film. Across the world, it grossed about $6 million on a $1.29 million budget. And Hitchcock would later go on to adapt some other du Maurier works, including Jamaica Inn and The Birds. While I've never seen the whole film before, I had caught bits and pieces of it here and there. My wife really loves this one, so she'd watch it every few years or so, and I'd catch a few scenes coming in and out of the room. So I knew the basics of the plot. The film opens with Joan Fontaine as the unnamed protagonist, narrating as we approach the ruins of Mandalay. Kind of reminding me of the opening of Citizen Kane as we pan across Xanadu. Which, as I was writing this, I realized Citizen Kane might have taken its inspiration from this for that shot. So, who knows? From that opening pan, we then cut to her meeting Laurence Olivier's Maxim de Winter standing on a cliffside, and she thinks he was going to jump. He's just kind of admiring the view and thinking is kind of the impression we get. She runs into him again at her Monte Carlo hotel, where she's a paid traveling companion for Mrs. Van Hooper. Kind of like a old lady's friend she would just pay to travel with her. The protagonist and De Winter fall in love while they're in Monte Carlo, and they get married and return to the English West Country estate of Mandalay. Now, back at the estate, the new Mrs. De Winter is welcomed by the large staff, except for her personal maid, Mrs. Danvers, who was actually Maxim's late wife, Rebecca's maid, and was extremely devoted to her. She came to Mandalay with her. She was her personal servant and stayed on. And Danvers is really pushing at her, trying to make her feel uncomfortable, and maybe even break up Maxim and her protagonist. And this is just how the movie goes for a while, until there's a shipwreck off the coast, and they find Rebecca's boat, and her body in the boat looks like it's been intentionally sunk. The original story was she had disappeared while boating, and Maxim had identified a body as hers. Obviously, it turned out not to be hers. So he confesses to our protagonist that Rebecca actually died after a fight, not on the boat. He had carried her to the boat and then deliberately sank it just to be rid of her because he thought he'd be accused of murder because the fight was about her cheating on him and that she was pregnant with another man's baby. And they had always been in a loveless marriage that was just there for convenience. The investigation is reopened because the stories don't match up. And Rebecca's cousin and lover blackmails Maxim, saying he knows she wasn't suicidal and he has proof, and assumed it was pregnant with his kid. But during the course of this investigation and the blackmail storyline, we find out that Rebecca wasn't pregnant, but she was actually dying of cancer. And this whole setup was to get Maxim to kill her because she didn't want to die slowly and wither away, and she kind of wanted to take him down in some way with her. But once the investigators find out that she had cancer, the suicide makes more sense. They just close the investigation. So Maxim's off the hook, and then they head back to Mandalay for the happy ending. But you find out that in a fit of, I don't want to say jealous rage, but in some kind of weird revenge, Mrs. Danvers has burnt down the manor and she dies inside during the fire. And that's the end of the film. To me, the real meat of the film, where they're at Mandalay before the whole murder plot kind of comes in, really plays like a non-supernatural ghost story, and that's really what I felt like. Our protagonist is literally haunted by the mere concept of Rebecca hanging over her and all of Mandalay, just like this shroud. It feels as Maxim is so hung up on her, and the protagonist is urged by the staff and belittled by Mrs. Danvers, and she tries to slide into Rebecca's shoes. But since she was a kind of a poor orphan, we find out, she had no idea how to fill the role of this aristocratic lady of a manor, throw these parties and charities and all that. She had no correspondence to fill her days writing. So she just wanders aimlessly around the estate. But this overwhelming manner and atmosphere is beautiful, but it just kind of seems to feel like a prison for her. And it's here you sometimes can't figure out if Danvers is pushing the protagonist away or into becoming Rebecca and showing her around Rebecca's room, showing her how to use her brushes, her clothes, pushing her to dress like Rebecca for this costume ball, which really sets off Maxim. And then you kind of get the impression it was kind of trying to drive the wedge between her and Maxim and get her out of the house because she doesn't want her to replace Rebecca. This section alternated feeling like an atmospheric haunted house story, kind of like the original 1963 version of The Haunting, or a Victorian romance like Jane Eyre, particularly with the way you kind of feel the protagonist kind of fits that governess coming to the great house and not being welcome, but still romantically tied to the man of the house. Victorian romance is not one of my favorite things, so I could be conflating Jane Eyre and Wuthering Heights. I haven't read them since high school. The whole mood lightens, weirdly, with the revelation about Rebecca's death. While there's the seriousness of the inquiry and the blackmail in the third act, the relationship between the protagonist and Maxim improves greatly, giving us more reason to root for them as a couple. Before that, we're left on the fence about wanting them to work out, or, have our protagonist move on with her life if she's in this loveless marriage. But despite the improvement in her lifestyle, from essentially a servant to Miss Van Hooper to a member of a British aristocracy, we just really feel bad for her stuck in this, what appears to be a marriage of convenience with a man who appears to be so much her elder. Which is something a little odd, because Olivier was only 33 at the time of the movie. There's only about a 10-year difference between the actors, but you feel like there's like a 20-year gap between the characters. And the movie really does feel Hitchcockian with the twist in the middle, and the blackmail, and the surprise ending. And, I am a fan of his work. I've probably only seen like 10-20% of his movies. He does make a signature cameo at the end of the film. It's his latest cameo in all of his movies. I think later on, when it became more of a standard thing, he wanted it to be over. Usually he said in the first 15 to 30 minutes so people aren't playing Find the Easter Egg with him in the movie and he can focus on the plot. Well, anyway, for how I feel about the movie, I generally really enjoyed it. Though I think it did take a little bit to get going. The scenes in, I think it's Monte Carlo or Monaco, but feel very different than the rest of the film. But it really is a setup, and that's a good contrast to what happens when our protagonist gets to Mandalay. It's very lighthearted and romantic at the beginning, and then Maxim has to go off, so she's left alone in, as I said, this haunted house type atmosphere. And it's, to me, this storybook romance at the beginning, and all of a sudden Cinderella becomes entwined in this self-doubt that she doesn't belong with her Prince Charming. And that's kind of what you see in the middle of this film. And I think it plays really well. It's beautifully acted, beautifully shot. The effects, while you could tell are dated, still hold up pretty well, particularly the matte painting and model kind of the manor. Obviously, the scenes of them in the car are that standard rear projection that you would see as opposed to like a green screen today. But they're fine. There's nothing that feels that old about this film. Stylistically, no. I feel this movie can be made today. And the novel has been adapted to the screen 15 times. That's a lot. I mean, the most recent one was just on Netflix not too long ago. So there's just a lot there where this movie keeps getting remade, but I don't think any of them could have ever topped this. And the fact that it was Best Picture kind of says that. One of the weird things is this is not available on any streaming or even to buy digitally. I happen to have a copy on Blu-ray, so that's how I watched it. So it's really hard to recommend you go out and find this when it's so hard to find. It's very weird that it's not out there. So again, the third act feels very separate. We move into a storyline with high stakes and consequences. It feels very much more Hitchcock at this point. And if it wasn't Hitchcock, I wouldn't have felt the happy ending was not going to come. Sometimes with Hitchcock, you never know what your twist is going to be. And there were some great twists with this, like the fact that Maxim never wasn't hung up on Rebecca, that he was just worried about everything with Rebecca ever coming to light, and then that she wasn't pregnant, having cancer, and lots of little great twists that really make it a Hitchcock film, and the kind of thing we've come to associate with somebody like M. Night Shyamalan, who, always says he was big Hitchcock influence. But with that being said, I wonder if there was more doubt in the novel about the outcome, given that Maxim actually did murder Rebecca, and would there be consequences for him? Honestly, I don't know. I haven't read the novel, and I chose not to look that up as part of this discussion specifically because that's not the movie. I really like the way the investigation's played. It's done well. It's not overdrawn. It's not a courtroom drama, so things can take place in more than one room, and you can go to different places and have private conversations that make up the way the blackmail and the investigation's being played. All in all, I think the movie does stack up as an absolute classic. As I said, I don't think it's that dated. It's just hard to find. So, if you have a chance, see this movie. It really is something that deserved its Best Picture. It feels timeless as a story, and that's one of the reasons I guess it keeps being remade. But if you could ever find this original, I don't think it's any of the Hitchcock sets. I think we had the Blu-ray separately from the master Hitchcock set we have. It's a great movie. Really, really well done. And, well, thank you for watching Ron Hasn't Seen. We're going to continue our month of Oscar winners. Next week is The Apartment, something I completely knew nothing about going in. So if you like the channel, please like, subscribe, leave a comment below. If you want me to see any movies, you can see my movie list I've seen on Letterboxd. It's Ron Hasn't Seen. I've got a few more theme months coming up after this, but at a certain point, if people are watching, I want to know what they want me to watch and talk about. All right, thank you guys, and have a good night.